missing on the Russian side are still designed to largely shape the battlefield for the larger offensives to come. So what you're seeing with those arrows is accurate, but it's not exclusively in those areas. All along the line, the Russians are advancing, but there's no point in advancing in depth unless you're capturing something of value, and that's what Alex showed you in the diagram. They want to break up these lines of communication, resupply, call them whatever you will, and at the same time, they're positioning more and more forces for deep operations. And I think that's going to happen in the near future to the north near Kharkov. They've concentrated about 100,000 troops, and I think it's pretty obvious that's where they're headed. So there are going to be a number of offensive operations. And in the meantime, as you point out, large numbers of Ukrainian soldiers are doing one of two things. They're either refusing to fight and withdrawing in front of the Russians, or they're surrendering. And if you have a lot of casualties that you cannot evacuate, the smart move is to surrender to the Russians, because you know your soldiers will get medical care and will ultimately survive the war. If you have a lot of casualties and you decide to fight, then everyone dies together pointlessly. I think the Russians have made that point. I think that point has sunk in with the average Ukrainian unit. So I think we'll see more surrenders, and at the same time, more units simply leaving the battlefield because they can't stay without dying.
Yeah, I don't like to be macabre, but I saw a video by Russia when they took over a certain forest line near Berdichi in this same sector that Alex was showing there a second ago. And it was really gut-wrenching to have to look at. And I couldn't watch the whole thing, but one thing that really did stand out to me was two things, actually. One was that the Ukrainian side had dug very poor defensive positions, so they clearly had not had much time to prepare. But the other thing is that there was a large number of troops that had been casualties there, and you could see that some of them looked like that they had just died. Some of them looked like they had been there for a little while. Some looked like they had been there for a long time. That kind of really, in my mind, justified what you have said several times, is that the Ukraine can't get their wounded soldiers out. So if they get wounded, they all usually die in place on the battlefield.
Well, the other thing is, strategically, the smart move back a year and a half ago was to consolidate its strength along this defensive line and begin building subsequent defensive lines, because inevitably they knew the Russians would have to attack and drive them out. Unfortunately, they decided to attack, and in doing so, they weakened themselves unnecessarily. This sort of thing, this movie is one that history has shown previously. In early March of 1943, in a meeting with his top generals on the Eastern Front, you had a number of key figures like Guderian and Oliver Speer wasn't there, but his representatives were, and Milch from the Luftwaffe, all trying to persuade Hitler and the top generals. This is in early March 1943, a month after the surrender of Stalingrad, that it was time to fall back and to build subsequent lines of defense and stop attacking, go over to a strategic defense and let the Russians or the Soviets at that point expend themselves. That would have worked very, very well. Unfortunately, they didn't do it. And they went down the same road in Ukraine this time. So I don't think there's much left, Dan. This tragedy is almost over, and sending more money and arms isn't going to change the outcome at this point.
Now, how might it play out if it almost seems like if Russia's doing a shaping operation or a preparation in the eastern part here, but they're standing up something larger in the north, the question is going to be, will Ukraine have enough soldiers to actually handle two big operations like that? And might they even fall apart before this offensive start? Because it seems like it just feels like, and I may be wrong, but it feels like the cracks are getting close to breaking through.
No, I think you're right. I think the breakthroughs have already occurred at numerous points. They simply haven't been exploited. But remember, there's also been a problem with the ground. It's been very moist. The ground is now firming up. It's drying out. So I would expect that by the middle of May, late May, you'll see massive movement of Russian forces forward. Now, the question is, how far do they go? And I've always said they will definitely go to the Dnieper River. And that's largely because no one will negotiate with them. And as long as there's no willingness to talk to the Russians about finding a way to end this, they will continue to advance. And by the time they're through, it's anyone's guess how much terrain they will control. But as I've said before, I've always believed they would eventually control Odessa as well as Kharkov. So that means you've got to control the Dnieper River in order to use those bridges. And if there's no government in Kiev to negotiate with, then I suppose they have to consider crossing and moving right into Kiev. Now, of course, you've got the French right now who are supposedly going to send troops, and they've already sent a few, 7 of whom have been killed already in the neighborhood of Slovyansk, as I understand it. I think anybody that goes into Ukraine at this point is dead meat. We in the West don't have the force strength. We don't have the right mix of capabilities. The only thing we can do is contribute to the graveyard over there.
Now, that was actually on the second day of the war that Putin said that. And it caused a lot of people in the West to kind of back off a little bit. But then they slowly started just kind of putting a toe on the rudder, crossed that red line, that red line. You know, first it was artillery pieces, then it was tanks, then it was APCs and Patriots, and, you know, now then Storm Shadow missiles, now ATACMS. So everybody keeps crossing each line. They're going, okay, well, he doesn't mean it. But does he not mean it, Doug?
Yes, he very definitely does. And at this point in time, it would be especially ludicrous and self-defeating for the United States to test Russian will and resolve. They've been successful. They already hold 90% of what they're interested in. And there's nothing we can do to stop them from making it 100% of what they want, which again is this sort of crescent that runs from Kharkov down to Odessa. Now, if we suddenly said enough's enough, we understand and we're prepared to sit down and talk to you, I think they would meet with us, but they're the ones that'll do the talking and we're going to have to do the listening, which is something we don't like and are not accustomed to do, but they're on the winning side and we are not. So I think, yes, we should take him very seriously, and especially in light of something else you and I were discussing earlier, and that is the sudden appearance of F-16s that are capable of delivering a nuclear payload showing up in Ukrainian airspace.
Now, Doug, why in the world at this late stage would the West be saying, hey, you can now strike into Russia proper, which can only exacerbate and annoy Russia, but it can't change anything on the battlefield? Why would they risk that?
On one level, remember, these are people that have made ridiculous statements on policy from which they cannot retreat. I mean, if you've said that everything depends on what we're doing, and if we fail, the world is lost, then what do? You say desperate measures are justified, and you don't admit defeat until it becomes inescapable. We did that in Vietnam. If you go back and listen to the comments that were made in 1965, 66, 67, 68, you know, the South Vietnamese fight is our fight. Nonsense. Not our fight at all. In fact, everybody was trying to figure out what we were doing there to begin with. And secondly, if they fail, then they march on us and we'll have them in Los Angeles. It's the same sort of nonsense. Every decision that we have made in connection with the Russians, with this administration, has been impulse driven. No thinking, just emotion. And everyone gets together as a group. They have a huddle and then they emote. Oh, how terrible the Russians are. And we are on morally righteous ground. In the meantime, the Ukrainian nation is utterly destroyed. There are over 600,000 dead Ukrainian soldiers now. I don't know how many more casualties, certainly at least 1 million or more. Millions of Ukrainians have left. They're still trying to get out. The Ukrainian nation is on the ropes. But that doesn't matter because it's the morally right thing to do. Remember, that's what McGeorge Bundy wrote to McNamara in 1965. He said, well, you know, if we go into Vietnam, we probably won't win, but it's the morally right thing to do. We'll explain that to the dead, to the families that lose husbands and sons and God knows what else. There's nothing morally righteous about dying in a hopeless cause, particularly Absolutely. When the hopeless cause is the wrong cause. And that's the case in Ukraine. This government is anything but what we describe it as being. There's nothing democratic about it. So it's worse than authoritarian. It resembles Stalin's state, if anything.
Yeah, there's not a lot of recognition of that, although there's certainly some truth to it. Actually, a lot of truth to it. But
By the
here's
way, before we move on,
Yeah.
I'm sure you're aware that the so-called, debt holders for Ukraine, like BlackRock and others, are beginning to stir and saying we have to be paid back. I think the external debt is in the neighborhood of 161 or 171 billion dollars. Of course, the Ukrainians have nothing with which to pay it. They want debt forgiveness, and then they want to resume paying debts at some point in the future. And this is where the real danger comes in my judgment, is that these vulture capitalists like BlackRock will demand payment in kind. In other words, if you're not going to give us cash, then give us control of your territory. We want chunks of your rich farmland. We want to control what's there that belongs to you. Now it belongs to us. So this Ukrainian regime is besieged on all sides. It has no chance whatsoever.
And it could get worse, because in light of what Lord Cameron has said there, Russia's not sitting back passively. In fact, they responded. Gary, if you could throw up that headline here. This is from earlier today. The Russian military, the Russian government has warned the British ambassador that there will be a response if what Cameron said there over the weekend turns out to be true. If British missiles actually strike territory in Russia and destroy anything in there, Russia is saying today that they will respond in kind, and not necessarily only in Ukraine. So opening up the possibility that this war could expand if they make good on that. And that's been the concern from the beginning. And for a pretty good while, I thought, okay, well, it seems contained. We can keep it within Russia. But now it's like the West is taking actions that want to expand it. And I don't get that.
I think some time ago you talked about the conditions today reflecting the conditions that existed during the Cuban Missile Crisis. And I think that was a very logical and real comment that people should have taken more seriously. We didn't care if the missiles that were in Cuba were fired by Cubans. They were still Russian missiles. Then, of course, we detected there were Russian forces on the ground prepared to execute the mission, because obviously the Cubans weren't trained up to do it. And then we made it clear that this would spread, that if you're going to do this to us, then we will take action as we see fit elsewhere. The same thing holds true today for Moscow. Every day that passes, I'm astonished at the patience that President Putin and his government has exercised with regard to our, provocative stupidity. At some point, this is going to end. And I think the British are very foolish. Sometimes I think they believe it's really 1854 and it's the Crimean War. They don't understand that things have changed radically. And Britain is actually an afterthought militarily for the Russians. And if they're stupid and they persist and Russians are killed, then I would look out for attacks on British citizens. And if they think that NATO collectively is going to rise up as one and march off righteously to war that will inevitably escalate to the nuclear level, I think they've lost their minds. Well, I don't see a readiness anywhere to send troops anywhere to do anything. I mean, that's Macron's argument for French troops. He says no one will send anything, so we French have to do it.
This is according to the CBS News. Is the Hakeem Jeffries, United States continues to support Ukraine to prevent a broader war, and he blamed the delay in aiding the fight in Russia on, quote, pro-Putin faction of the Republican Party. And then he says, Hakeem says, we can't let Ukraine fall, because if it does, there is a significant likelihood that America will get into the conflict. And you see it continues to go on from there. But that idea is just absurd to me. But you can't laugh this guy off, because, he's the leader of the Democratic Party. And of course, there's a Democratic president in the White House. So we have to worry, do they actually believe this? And that's what I worry about, Doug. Maybe he really believes this and he's that disconnected from reality.
I think disconnected from reality is a perfect explanation. But unfortunately, neither of these men really know what they're talking about. They have no idea what's right and what isn't. I mean, these people have listened to the nonsense for so long that has come to them from their donors that they couldn't possibly consider any alternative. If your donor, the man or men or women that fill up your reelection campaign coffers, tells you this is our position, we want to back you, we'll support you, but push this to the hilt, that's exactly what they're going to do. They're going to push it to the hilt. Now, historically, we've usually had a president in the White House who was sufficiently sober-minded that he could put the brakes on people like this. We don't have that. It is indeed the uniparty, and it's donor-occupied territory, and the donors are essentially making policy. Everybody knows if you want to be perpetually in office, you've got to go along with what the donors want. The possibility that this could lead to all-out war with Russia and result in God knows how many Americans being killed in pointless conflict with Russia that's not actually our enemy, I don't know. I mean, if it goes to the nuclear level, we know that in the first hour of a nuclear exchange with Russia, we are likely to lose 90 million dead. Now, I'm sure the Russians would face something equally awful, which is why Putin keeps saying, we don't want Armageddon. And I don't think they do, because he knows that Russia will lose. But of course, his comment is, in contrast to you, we will go as martyrs to heaven. Well, God bless him. Maybe he will, but I don't think anybody's going to be very happy about leaving the planet Earth in a nuclear holocaust. And they tend to dismiss that as something that's impossible. But yet, with each passing day, we do things that make it more and more plausible.